They say there are moments when a town holds its breath, so hard even the dust won't move. The night it happened, the Desert Star had that kind of hush. Lamps humming, piano strings cooling, a promise of thunder pressed under every boothiel. No one knew which second would split the dark, only that it would come like a lash of lightning and leave the air tasting like iron. Delilah Ford crouched on the edge of a dry river as noon rolled over it like a hot coin. The signboards along Main hung by tired nails and complained to the wind in different languages of wood. Sunlight pooled in the ruts where wagon wheels had carved their arguments. Flies wrote their scriptures above a horse trough that pretended to be a pond. And at the town's slow-beating heart, the Desert Star Saloon squinted at the day, its swinging doors yawning as if each man who passed might be the last story it ever heard. Inside, he'd had a voice. It whispered from the glass chimney of every lamp and sang from the brass of the piano whenever the old keys were touched. The smell of coffee and rye braided with cigar smoke until the room wore it like a shawl. Cards clicked. Coins argued. Most faces made a habit of watching without being seen. He kept to the edges because edges offered exits. Ezra Cole liked the table by the near window where late light laid itself across his knuckles. His shirt was plain and scrubbed hard enough to have earned its white. The cuffs were mended with narrow stitches, the kind made by a man who knows what it costs to be careless. His hat carried the memory of rain. He drank coffee long after decent men moved to harsher comforts, stirring the same cup as if the patience in the motion might brew something stronger than beans. Folks had learned he meant no trouble by the same route. They learned most truths, slowly, by repeating what didn't happen. He never argued with a piano, never gambled enough to be worth cheating, never reached for the thing men think makes them large. But he listened, to the telegraph tapping behind the wall, to the clink of a bottle set down too hard, to the nervous laughter that rises when fear is still deciding whether to stay. Listening had taught him that most storms show their first cloud hours before the first drop. Listening had kept him alive. Alma Reyes stepped onto the low stage that fought to call itself a platform, and the room's rough geometry softened. She wore a dress the color of afternoon shade and held herself like a pitcher balanced high, every line steady because to waver would spill what mattered. When she sang, it sounded like the first rain that doesn't quite reach the ground, sent before water, promised before proof. Her eyes met no one and saw everyone. Men who had not been home in years remembered kitchens. Men who had not prayed since boyhood found language gathering in their throats like birds. She didn't bow to laughter. She never flinched when the piano stumbled. Every note carried work and dignity, as if she were stitching something back together with sound. In a town that measured mercy by ounces, she poured by the cup. They arrived late enough to be noticed, for men clattered out of the sun as if they had been hammered from the same mean ore. The dry needle outfit, so named, it was said, because they pierced what they couldn't hold. Dust lived in the seam of their hats. Spurs ticked like ill-tempered clocks. Their leader let the door slap his flanks and stood a breath too long in the entrance, as if the room ought to send him an invitation. Pike Durgan's mouth carried a scar that tugged his smile sideways and made it look like he disliked the joke the world kept telling. Pike surveyed the saloon the way a man inspects a fence he plans to cut. He found the biggest shadow and walked through it, shouldering it aside so everyone could see that even darkness made room for him. His laugh had no warmth. It came up raw and left the same way, as if joy were a thing he'd broken trying to learn its purpose. Men who could have looked away didn't. Men who should have stood up didn't either. Afternoon beauties. One of his boys said to a pair of girls playing at cards near the bar, and the word was shaped like a shove. Another shouldered the piano and made a chord yelp. The barkeep wiped a place on the counter that had been cleaned since morning. The sheriff wasn't there. He was often where decisions took longer. Pike's eyes lit on Alma as a coyote's might on a calf too near the wire. He bent in mock appreciation, clapped slow, and let the last clap land dead. "Sing us something true," he said. The words dragged over gravel. Alma's chin tilted a thumb's width higher, a gesture that cost her nothing and purchased her the room. "All my songs are true." "That why you don't need to smile at us?" Pike asked, and his boys chuckled like rain on a tin roof that never becomes storm. She went on singing as if nothing had been asked. That was her refusal, and it was elegant, and it offended him in a way he did not understand. The first bottle toppled in his wake, not from clumsiness, but from intent, amber rolling, the puddle flattening itself against the wood, as if trying to hide. Ezra's cup stilled. His eyes continued their study of the window's light, but the line of his shoulders adjusted by a degree a carpenter would respect. He did not look at Pike. He looked at the reflection of the room's edges in the glass, and measured what they could do to each other. Pike drifted toward Ezra's table the way grass fire drifts, without haste, trusting the world to be dry enough to catch. He tapped Ezra's cup with a knuckle, and waited for the sound to give him something to hate. "Coffee in August," he said. "This man's got courage." Ezra's gaze stayed on the light. "It does the job." "What job's that?" Pike asked. "Keeping my hands busy. That way your mouth doesn't get you hurt." A boy laughed then, a small, hungry sound, and the laughter sought friends in the corners. It found them. The barkeep swallowed a word he couldn't afford to spend. Cards resumed their nervous patter, because quiet is often the most dangerous noise in a room. Alma slid her song into a minor key, as if to gather the scattered edges, and tuck them close. Ezra felt the change the way men feel the weather in the bones of old injuries. One of Pike's boys shouldered past a woman carrying a tray, and the tray went up, then down, a clatter that made the piano jump. Whiskey ran like quick roots. The boy apologized to the whiskey and to no one else. He planted his boot on the leg of Ezra's chair and leaned as if investigating an insect. "Friend," he said, "you listening to the lady or to us?" Ezra met his own eyes in the window and considered the question there first, as if the glass might offer counsel. "I'm listening," he said. "To what?" Pike asked from just behind the boy's shoulder, near enough to share breath, far enough to deny intent. "Everything," Ezra said. Pike's smile tugged wrong at the scar, turned into something that resembled pity if a man squinted at it from a far side of hope. Man who listens that wide, he hears trouble before it remembers his name. He glanced at Alma again. "We're just admiring the entertainment." "She's not yours to admire," Ezra said, softly enough that only the people who needed to hear it heard it. "There are lines that lie asleep in a room until a sentence wakes them." That one opened its eyes. The boy with his boot on Ezra's chair put weight into it. The chair held. Ezra's cup shifted and steadied. He did not. Ezra stepped once, and the space between Alma and the men became his. He didn't square his shoulders or puff himself out. He simply occupied the air as if he'd been intended for that particular inch of floor since the boards were laid. "You'll apologize," he said. The words sounded smooth, not a splinter on them. "You'll do it now and you'll mean it." The room leaned to hear, expecting thunder and getting rain that soaks deeper. Alma's breath feathered his sleeve. He could feel the heat of the mark on her cheek, the way a blacksmith feels whether iron is ready by listening. He kept his hands down, palms visible, as if displaying empty tools before starting delicate work. His gaze never rose to anger. It held steady at duty, and the duty was simple: keep the world from worsening. Pike tested that claim the way a man tests ice with his heel. He smiled, turned as if to leave, and came back with a faint no stage ever saw. His shoulder dipped, his hip drove forward, and his boy with the big had surged from the flank with a bottle swinging a lazy halo. Ezra slid half a step, not back but sideways, and the swing passed where he'd been, dragging air that smelled like rye and bad decisions. The chair behind him should have shattered. He caught it with a hand, eased it down, and it never learned what breaking felt like. The boy stumbled into the place Ezra wanted him, and paused there, because Ezra's fingers had found elbow and wrist at once, a soft twist that felt like suggestion until the bones called it law. Pike's second shove came quicker, a palm at the sternum meant to make a point. Ezra yielded enough to accept the message, and paid it back by stepping into Pike's shadow, emptying it. A room can mistake quiet for weakness until it sees how fast quiet moves. Ezra's hands worked like a telegrapher's, precise, economical, every motion meaning only itself. He plucked the bottle from the boy's grip without fighting it, letting momentum pour the weapon into his own palm, then set it upright on the table as if returning a cup to a friend. A pistol but showed under a coat. Two fingers curled it free as gently as a mother lifting a sleeping baby, and with a sly roll of the wrist the cylinder slipped, 6 little coins chiming onto the tablecloth. The boy looked at the naked revolver like it had betrayed him. Another hand reached from behind for Ezra's collar. Ezra's thumb and forefinger found a pressure point and pressed memory into muscle. This is what it feels like when you decide to stop. He guided a knee to a chair, set a man down without asking, and patted his shoulder as though easing him into church. "Enough," Ezra said, not loud, which made it travel farther. Word doesn't stay in a saloon. It evaporates and returns as weather. By dusk, every porch in Delilah Ford knew the Dry Needle Boys had been halted by a man who didn't raise his voice and barely raised his hands. Folks repeated the pieces that made them brave to repeat and swallowed the ones that scared them. The Dry Needle Boys, people recalled, weren't born here. They grew like burrs along the freight road, bleeding wagons for toll, trimming payrolls, taking cuts on dynamite and flour alike. They owned a corner of the livery, by the kind of favor you don't refuse twice, and they paid in scrip issued by the same merchant who sold them whiskey at a discount. The sheriff, some said, kept looking away because he liked his windows whole. Others said Brand had a ledger of sins and no ink to write with, no deputies, no jailer, no judge for weeks at a time, just a key, a cot, and a town that asked law to be gentle unless it came with a badge and a cavalry band. There was a rumor, too, that Brand owed Pike a debt from a winter when feed ran out, and a man did what he had to so families didn't. Rumors work like burrs as well. They cling until somebody braves the pain to pull them free. Alma didn't traffic in rumor. After the room decompressed and breath found its way back into bodies, she touched Ezra's sleeve as a woman confirms a table won't wobble. "Gracias," she said, the word a small clear bell. Up close her composure was a woven thing. He could see the threads in it, strong because they crossed and crossed. She told him quietly, because quiet belongs to certain truths about Luis, her brother, stubborn and beautiful as a mule, running goats on a leased patch along the Juniper Rim. The spread was a miracle purchased on poor terms, paper with more teeth than a coyote, interest like summer heat, water rights that depended on who woke first and whose cattle drifted where. Luis believed in fences and fate in equal measure. He thought goats were future because goats eat what the land is willing to give, and he loved them for their nerve. Alma sang at the Desert Star not because she loved men's eyes, but because goats needed hay, and the ledger needed lines, and every coin bent toward a roof that did not leak in the windy months. Pike dusted the front of his coat as if the room had failed him. His scar tugged a line across his mouth that wasn't a smile and wasn't not. He looked at Ezra the way a gambler considers a deck he suspects is honest, unable to forgive it. "You're fast," he said, flexing the hand he'd used to push. "Fast and polite. That's a trick I've not seen mastered." His boys, suddenly without angles to occupy, gathered themselves and their dignity in mismatched handfuls. "Tell the lady you're sorry," Ezra said. He didn't lift his chin, because elevation is what men use when they mean to look down. He kept his level and his language the same. Pike's eyes touched Alma's cheek and moved off it quick, as if the red there had burned him by reflection. "Ma'am," he said, the syllables skidding like a boot on shale. He didn't offer more than the word. He turned to go and stopped in the doorway, where light from the street rode his outline into the room. He found Ezra again, tucked him into memory the way a hunter measures a notch in the canyon for the day the sun climbs perfect. "Night falls hard on singers and saints," he said, voice almost tender. "We'll be back when the lamps paint different shadows." The door slapped against his shoulders, and the sound was unkind. For a few heartbeats, the room stayed in the posture of a held breath, every man inside measuring whether courage had been removed like a splinter or only pushed deeper under the skin. The piano tried a note as a scout tries a ford, and then tried another. Glasses lifted and returned to the wood with the soft punctuation of choices made. Alma's hand trembled once, not when Pike spoke, not when he left, but now, in the ordinary after. Ezra's palm hovered near hers and then fell back, because restraint has its own strength, and not every bridge must be crossed the second it's built. Outside, heat still lay like an old dog across the street. Inside, The barkeep started a rumor on purpose by saying to no one in particular that Sheriff Brand would have to pick a side come sundown. Ezra looked at the window and saw not his reflection, but the river of dust that wandered the road toward the canyon rim, where a goat spread clung to stubbornness, and a brother counted kids against debt with fingers that never reached the last number. He could feel the wire in the wall behind him humming to itself, letters chattering toward somewhere men promised justice lived. He considered sending a message and decided he already had. Here, with his hands and his voice and a chair that never broke. The night walked him home. Mesquite shadows braided over the road and unbraided again with every step. Thorny silhouettes threading across Alma's skirt as she kept pace beside Ezra. A coyote lifted its throat from somewhere beyond the ditch and let loose a note that sounded like loneliness choosing courage. Lamps dwindled behind them until the Desert Star was a rumor and the town a hush that couldn't decide between sleep and worry. Alma didn't cling to his arm. She matched him, stride for stride, wearing her silence like a shawl that kept dignity warm. He kept to the wagon ruts where the ground remembered weight, listening with the old parts of himself, the ones that heard trouble before it learned to speak. Her house rose from the pale earth where the road leaned toward the canyon rim, a narrow place stitched from boards, patience, and the smell of beans and clean water. 2 fig trees stood in the yard like small, stubborn saints. The goats in the pen muttered the day's gossip to one another, hooves tapping soft questions into the dirt. Luis's had waited on a peg, brim scarred by weather and pride. Ezra paused at the gate as a dog might, nose to the wind, head a fraction turned. Mesquite shavings glittered under starlight, where the fence line unkinked, and then kinked again, as if confused about its duty. He crouched, touched a wire that had been clipped and twisted back with haste, not care. Hoof marks crossed the hardpan at an angle that insulted the road, a scatter of crescents with the blunt confidence of men who don't expect to be chased. By the fig roots lay a spent tobacco twist, pinched flat by a boot that had no business near the tree. He lifted it with a matchstick, not his fingers, and held it where moonlight could tell him more than smell did. Sweet leaf, cheap. The dry needle boys liked better. Hired help, then, or pike using lesser bait. They've been here, Alma said, and it was not a question. Her voice didn't reach for fear. It reached for assessment, which is a harder thing and braver. Not long, Ezra answered. Watching, being certain we live where we do. Luis would have chased him, she said. He likely did, Ezra said, and in the soft smile that followed you could hear his respect for a man's stubbornness, even when it was the wrong tool. He walked the property as a reader walks a page he intends to memorize. Under the sill of the kitchen window lay a small curl of ash. Shavings by the coop door carried the grittier bite of a knife sharpened in haste. He stitched it all together and found a shape he didn't like. When he returned to the gate, Alma stood with her hands folded at her waist the way she stood before a final chorus, waiting to hear whether the note in her chest matched the day's key. Sleep with wet blankets over your windows, Ezra said, and keep a kettle hot. Smoke gets greedy when it finds fabric. She didn't ask why. And you, she said, I'm going to speak with a wire. Delilah Ford's telegraph office, perched at the bend of Maine, like a book left open. Ezra let himself in with a key the clerk had once pressed into his hand during a fevered week of freight accidents, as a man presses a psalm into a minister's palm. The switchboard glowed faint as an eyelid. He sat, cradled the key, and let his breath find the clock of his hands. The code came back like a hymn, not because he wanted it, but because he was built to keep it. He didn't sign Ezra. He never had, not when it mattered. He signed Whisper because that was the name operators respected when thunder traveled faster than horses. To Brand he sent the bones, dry needle riding after dark. 4, maybe 5. Pike at the mouth. Town needs your backbone tonight, not tomorrow. He added the sort of details sheriffs use to build reasons later. Marks on the fence, a twist of tobacco, hoof cuts shallow, from light riders. To a man in Tucson whose reply he did not expect soon, he sent a longer shape. Durgan moved north. Same scar. Same habits. Will try for leverage, family and fire. Request circuit judge speed, or mess will rot. He ended the last with a single click only the old hands would read as promise. "I'll keep it clean." When he stepped back into the night, the stars had shuffled themselves into fresh arrangements as if to keep him guessing. He walked the rim road to Alma's again, past the black seam of the canyon, where wind flowed like cold water, carrying juniper and distance. He slept on a chair by her door, boots on, mind in pieces that listened for separate news. The scrape of metal, the mutter of men, the stupid courage of goats. The hours loosened their grip and then remade it. Morning arrived with the color of hammered tin and a breeze that had learned politeness from the fig leaves. Luis rolled in from the upper pasture whistling a tune that failed to find itself. He smelled like sun and goat and the work of someone who intends to outlast paper. He shook Ezra's hand hard enough to declare a truce, then immediately began telling him how fences ought to be mended in soil like this. Alma made coffee. The three of them sat on the step and watched the goats negotiate with weeds. For the length of a cup, the world pretended it could be simple. Alma teased her brother about the goat who thought it was a dog. Luis called her the only person who could make a song sit and heal. Ezra let their talk rest on him. Beneath it, the canyon kept time the way a giant keeps breath, slow in, slow out, a rhythm patient enough to count years. He listened to it the way he listened to wires, hearing the smallest new thing, a pebble loosened, a crow's complaint, the hush that means a predator has written its name and erased it again. He mended a hinge on the yard gate, put a new twist where the fence had been mistwisted before, and noted the far line of dust that did not choose to be wind. Afternoon sloped toward evening with the lazy entitlement of summer. Heat softened. Shadows lengthened and met across the yard like old friends with new grudges. Ezra felt the change before he could name it, pressure on the air, a held breath. He stood and the seconds arranged themselves into a row. The first sign was a faint hiss, the sound a match makes when it tells a dry world yes. A spear of smoke leaped behind the coop, a smart, sharp flare that looked accidental and wasn't. The goats scattered, a white-brown river of panic, sluicing through the pen. Luis ran toward the gate, calling names like a shepherd in a parable, and smack in that calling came the men, two from the flank with sacks, one from the yard with a rope, moving like wind does when it knows the shape of the pass. "Luis!" Alma cried, and in her cry Ezra heard exactly where the trap preferred its teeth. He moved before the thought finished forming, a direct line through stagger. One man's arm met Ezra's shoulder and decided to be elsewhere. A second saw his rope eaten by a hand that knew which knot would come undone with a single pull. But fire is a language men answer even when they shouldn't. Smoke curved around the porch, found the blankets as they flew, a smart defense not quite soon enough, and rolled back, pleased with itself. In that moment Luis vanished into the fold of two horses and a third that shouldn't have fit, and the dust behind them curled like a signature. Juniper Canyon accepted him the way a cathedral accepts a penitent, without question, with a hush that makes a man mind his feet. Moonlight poured down the chalk walls like milk, pooling in ledges, catching on juniper spines until each thorn wore a cold bead. The wind moved in long, thoughtful breaths, a giant sleeping and turning now and then, and the ground spoke softly of old water. Ezra slipped along the rim path, where the limestone flaked under his soles, and gave nothing away but a whisper. Bats wrote cursive in the air. A nightjar clicked once, and decided the matter settled. He let the dark describe itself around him and, step by step, became one more fact in it. Moving brought back the older rhythm, and with it came the name he had folded and hidden for years. Whisper Cole. It hadn't begun as a boast. It was what soldiers muttered after he passed through a picket line and returned with the enemy's count and the color of their horses. As an army scout, he had lived between sound and action, mapping springs no map wanted to admit, reading the silences of arroyos, hearing where a man's certainty would fail him. Later, wearing a badge that wasn't government but felt harder, Pinkerton brass polished by suspicious hands, he had gone where payrolls vanished and rail spikes turned into knives. He'd smoked out 3 boxcar thieves by moving their lanterns half an inch and letting the wrong shadows bloom, lifted a banker's prodigal son from a hotel where shame was cheaper than whiskey, ghosted a rustler outfit across the Utah flats until their leader threw his hat at the moon and surrendered to the only enemy he feared, a conscience he'd misplaced. He did it without noise. He could stand beside a loaded rifle and never wake it to danger. He could cross a porch with a rattler coiled under the step, and both of them would keep their teeth to themselves. Operators liked him because he treated their keys like psalms. Sheriffs tolerated him because he brought law to the door wrapped so neat you could sit on a shelf. The trouble with walking that close to violence is you start believing you're immune to it. Then the creek burst. A boy, freckled, too brave by half, had gone down in a churn of spring water while bullets clipped alder leaves into confetti. Ezra had his hand around the boy's wrist, skin slick, bones small as the inside of a wing. He'd counted breaths, counted the shots left in a cylinder across the creek, counted everything except the current's mind. One misweight of a foot on moss, one more second of staying quiet when he should have shouted, and the river simply took the boy. The emptiness after was a fact too large for sound. That night he folded guns and laid them on a table as you lay a body. He swore to carry wire and patience instead, to hold men, not end them, to keep breath where breath belonged. He promised himself he would not be the instrument by which someone's mother learned what grief weighs. Down canyon, amber pricked the dark and steadied, a camp where men trusted flame more than their wits. Ezra climbed a spur of rock, belly to stone, and studied. 5 bedrolls, 1 empty and 2 tidy. A circle of light that left the edges blind. A pair of burros dozing, their ears turned to the rumor of coyotes. Luis lay tethered near the burros, rope around wrists, a rag at his mouth to make courage costlier. 2 sentries paced badly, dragging heels and gossip. The smell of tallow and cheap tobacco sat low in the air. Pike had set himself apart, on a fallen log where the fire licked his boots and the moon made a pale border around his hat brim. He drank the way a man drinks when he wants his rage to have an excuse. Ezra withdrew as water does when it decides to be missed. He began making a place where his promise could do work. From his pack he pulled the coil of telegraph wire, thin as truth, strong as days. He measured lengths against his forearm and looped them with a knot that would release when pulled from the right angle. He laid trip lines at shin height along the paths the sentries were unconsciously cutting for themselves, the wires kiss-light over rock, anchored to roots that had no intention of failure. He set 2 snares not for throats but for elbows, crossing the wire under boulders so a trapped arm would bind itself across the chest, a harness of humility. He found their string of horses and slid under bellies like a rumor, sliced stirrup leathers where no one would notice until a boot found air. He loosened cinches by a hole and a breath, enough to turn momentum into embarrassment when the mount startled. At the far edge of camp, he lifted a kettle lid and placed a horseshoe against it so a kicked stone would ring a wrong bell. He emptied a lantern of its glass chimney and reassembled it with a baffle cut from oiled paper, so a sudden gust would cough the flame dark and make men's hearts believe in rifle fire where there was none. Smoke wants to be a language. He wrote with it in whispers. A pinch of damp sage set in a nest of dry needles, where the fire's own breath would tug the curl away from camp and into brush, a decoy for alarm. He propped a small mirror in the crook of a shrub at an angle that would catch moon and throw it once across Pike's face when he moved through a certain narrow. He checked it with ash on his finger, dulling it until it would blink and go blind again. Then he shaped the ground where the choice would be made. He found a fault line of gravel that sloped toward a depression and set his longest line there, and looped around a stone that would roll when asked and jam a knot into itself. It would not choke. It would insist. He paused on a ledge and let his breath match the canyons. Doubt laid a hand on his shoulder, the way an old pain checks to see if it's still loved. He pressed the doubt aside with the thought of a boy's wrist slick in a creek and the sound a mother makes when she understands. Mercy, he reminded himself, isn't softness. Mercy is measurement. At the high bend where the trail thins to a goat's opinion and the wind stands still to hear itself, he left a message where only a watcher with Alma's eyes would see. He knelt and drew 3 short lines in the dust, parallel as stitches, danger set, plan in motion. Beside them he made a crescent in ash, cup toward town, hold. He placed 5 pebbles in a tight V pointing east. If you come late, and from that way. He pressed the ash with his thumb to smooth it, then wrote a single word with a twig. Quick so the wind would keep the secret, trust. When he rose, the sign was nothing more than the memory of a cook fire and children's play. But Alma read songs the way other people read faces. He believed she'd read stones likewise. He eased back toward the camp mouth and listened to men who had gotten used to their own voices. Pike complained that the sheriff had gone blind on purpose. A boy joked about goats that look you in the eye like they're measuring your sins. Louis shifted and the rope whispered. Ezra let his mind step through the plan once more, not as fantasy, but as geometry. Fault, line, weight, light, smoke, ring, cut, slip, bind. He held his promise where he could see it. He pictured Alma's hands folding a blanket against a window, her jaw set. He pictured the silver spur he had pocketed, a bright lie ready to be turned into proof. The wind slid a cool palm along his neck. The moon lowered itself a little, as if volunteer to witness. Pitch hissed in a small iron cup and threw a hungry flare across the camp, painting Pike Durgan's boots in molten orange. He sat slouched on a fallen log like a man taking confession from the fire, bottle balanced on his knee, the scar at his mouth catching light and turning it into a mean hook. Beyond him, Luis lay tethered near the burrows, rope at his wrists, gag at his teeth, eye steady in the way of someone who understands panic is a tax you can't afford. 5 bedrolls ringed the coals with the carelessness of men who'd slept easy too long. A lantern on a crate hummed. Another lantern bled a circle of yellow over a saddle that had seen better riders. The canyon held its breath so completely that when a moth touched flame, the whole camp looked up as if heaven itself had flinched. Ezra rinsed the first lamp with night. A faint breath, a finger over the vent, and the flame bowed out without complaint. He slipped along the horses, palm a hush against a wither, knife flicking through a stirrup leather as if trimming a memory. Cinches lost a hole they'd been certain of. A tether loosened by half a knot. He moved hardly faster than thought, letting the camp's own fidgets cover him, boots shifting, a man coughing, Pike grinding the bottle mouth against his teeth as if he might drink glass if whiskey ran short. By the far kettle he set a horseshoe, so it leaned into the iron lid, a quarter of an inch from singing. He stepped back and flicked a pebble. The ring that leapt out wasn't loud, but the canyon gathered it and threw it back like a shot through vaulted stone. Men ducked, hands went to belts, and a sentry laughed to convince his fear it was small. The loosened cinches did their quiet work. A horse sidestepped at a shadow and a saddle slid, dragging a boot that expected leather and found air. Its rider squawked a curse, fell hard on pride, and knocked his hat into the fire. Ezra slid in, plucked the hat out with a stick, slapped it against the dirt, and was gone before the man could thank his guardian angel or name his enemy. A second lamp coughed and died when its baffle caught a breath of wind the canyon had been saving. Darkness unstitched the edges of faces. Pike rose, bottle in one hand, pistol in the other, and took a step into the mirror's wink. The moon flashed once in his eyes. He grimaced and fired at a shrub that had been innocent since creation, the shot making the burrows dance and the tide man roll away from hooves with a grace born of necessity. Ezra flowed through the sudden clatter and found the boy with the big hat from the saloon. The boy swung wild. Ezra let the swing go past and borrowed the arm with a turn of the wrist that convinced Bone to agree. He guided the boy to a log and sat him there with a hand at the shoulder, then reached for a carbine leaning against a crate. He gripped it the way a staff is gripped when a flood tries to talk a man off his feet. Pike caught the shape of that movement and smiled, a short, cruel thing that said he recognized a man who knew weapons. He came on. Close fighting has no witnesses and no patience. The first lunge met Ezra's stock, turned by an inch so force spilled harmless past. The butt of the carbine rapped a rib as a schoolmaster taps a desk when the class ought to listen. Ezra didn't chase pain. He planted the band of the carbine across a reaching arm and let it become a hinge. Pike shoved and found the hinge held. Another of his men rushed low, knife a streak. Ezra stepped, brought wood down on the knife wrist with the exact weight required to persuade, and the blade rang against a stone none of them had noticed 10 seconds before. Hands grabbed behind. Ezra gave ground that was already trapped, letting his shin meet the kiss of a wire no thicker than a thought. The man folded, breath departed, and the knight kept his secret. Coward, Pike spat, swinging in a tight arc, anger choosing power over accuracy. The pistol swept up and Ezra slid inside, shoulder to chest, carbine stocked snug against Pike's sternum. He turned, hips first, carrying Pike into the tumble of gravel he'd measured at dusk. The pistol scraped out and skittered. Ezra's left hand found the coil at his belt, and the telegraph wire whispered into his palm, like a snake remembering its road. He looped it not at the throat, never there, but under Pike's arm and across his back, across the second shoulder and under the opposite elbow, yoking him to himself. Pike strained and found the bind became tighter for wrestling. Every thrash paid out another inch of humility that cinched into place. Ezra locked the loop against a buried stone and breathed once, deep, to remind blood what it is for. Luis made a sound behind the gag, something that belonged to triumph, but wore the coat of fear. Ezra turned to him. A shadow lunged where no shadow belonged. The carbine rose, blocked a club, bucked once, and Ezra drove the assailant backward into the line that would not break bones, but would make Will reconsider. The wire bit across the chest. The man sat involuntarily, astonished at the invention of sitting. Get him! Pike roared, thrashing into the harness until the wire sang. Fury found his hands and then found the camp. He kicked the pitch cup, sent the flare spitting into brush where Ezra's damp sage waited for exactly this in. Flame leapt and then choked, smoked with vigor, poured a dark curtain between the fire and the canyon wall. Men coughed, cursed, flailed at heat that wasn't yet hot, and shot into smoke because smoke asked them to. A voice at the rim cut neatly through the mess. Quiet, it snapped, a woman's command as practical as a knot. Alma knelt behind a boulder with a rifle braced clean. Hand steady not in spite of fear, but because she'd learned how to make fear hold a bandage and keep its mouth shut. She'd come on the long line of the ridge, found Ezra's ash marks and pebbled V, and read the instruction he'd left there. The rifle's sight rode slow across a man's forearm that tried to climb a trigger. Alma's breath settled on the third count, and she put a round under the wrist that wasn't killing and wasn't kind, either. It was instruction. The gun clattered. The man, shocked to be whole, decided righteousness could wait for morning and backed away toward the ground. Pike stopped bucking long enough to see her. He grinned with half a mouth. "Brought your choir?" he asked, and twisted again against the wire, reddening his own skin with negation. "She brought a spine," Ezra said, and flipped the carbine into his palm, stock ready. Alma slid from cover to Luis like a thought that had practiced the route all its life. She cut the rope at his wrists with a knife she had borrowed from a saddle he no longer recognized. The movement had a grace made of urgency and memory. "Roll to me," she said in a low voice that brooked no argument, and Luis rolled, trusting tone more than air. She wedged her knee under his shoulder, looped the free rope across his chest and under his arm in a sling that let him move and protected the bruised place she'd seen even in the smoke. "On your side till breathing quiets," she murmured, fingers reading him like a ledger, finding where cost had been assessed. When another of Pike's men lurched from the haze, Alma snatched a still-lit lantern, blew hard, and plunged the smoking chimney against his vision. He recoiled, striking nothing except the oath he'd swung. "Medic," Ezra realized aloud. How she rolled, how she guarded the ribs, how she made wounded people taller with cloth. She didn't look up, didn't take the praise. She was busy rearranging fate. Dawn came late to the canyon. A pale rumor laid along the rim before it dared the camp. Smoke thinned to blue threads. Men who had shouted themselves important slumped where the ground had explained otherwise. Pike Durgan knelt in the harness Ezra had set on him, wire crossing his chest and back like a stubborn lesson. His breath sawed. His eyes were clear in the way of men who've painted themselves into a corner and intend to blame the brush. Ezra stood close enough to share the cold. He held a canteen in one hand and the night's patience in the other. "There's a way this ends where you walk out," he said. The words slow, weighted, each one set down as if it might bruise the earth. "You call your men off when the sheriff comes. You sign papers. You make restitution. You leave singers and saints alone. You don't come back." Pike looked at the canteen, then at Ezra, and chose spite for thirst. "You want a sermon," he said, Scar tugging his mouth into something that thought it was mirth. "I brought a knife." "You don't have to use it," Ezra said. He lifted the canteen anyway and tipped water against Pike's lower lip. "A mercy you don't earn is still water." "Untie me," Pike said. "Let's see who you are without your string tricks." "I'm the same man," Ezra said, "with or without string." Hoofbeats pried at the distance, still far, steady, official. The sound made men remember who their mothers wanted them to be. Ezra eased the loop around Pike's shoulder, loosening the bind so he could be walked rather than dragged. "This is your last chance," he said, and the sentence fell between them like a tool laid on a bench. "Choose it." Pike's hands moved as if to stretch blood back into fingers. He stood, shoulders rolling, the wire slack enough to pretend it freed him. For one precise breath, he looked exactly like a man measuring the road that might yet save him. Then his right hand became a quick shadow. A boot knife snicked gold at the hilt where sweat had polished it, thin as a lie and twice as eager. Ezra stepped back because mercy gives room. Pike lunged because pride doesn't know how not to. The ground, which had already been taught its lines, took over. Pike's lead foot found the low trip Ezra had laid along the gravel fault. The stone Ezra had set as anchor rolled and jammed exactly where it should. Pike's weight flew forward and met earth, shoulder first. The knife left his hand, made a bright arc, and stuck in the dirt like a poor flag claiming nothing. Ezra's carbine came up, but not to strike. He placed a band across Pike's wrists and leaned until anger had to choose between breathing and flailing. It chose breath. Ezra retied the harness with 3 calm pulls, and it drew itself true as if relieved to be useful again. "You could have walked," Ezra said. "I did," Pike croaked, cheeks scuffed, wire drawing firm lines across his skin. "Right into your Sunday school rope." "I made the ground honest," Ezra answered. "It told you the truth. You argued." The hoofbeats unfolded into horses at the camp's mouth, silhouettes squaring against light. Sheriff Brand had low against the birth of day, with 3 men who sat their saddles the way duty sits a spine. They took in the scene in a slow, respectful sweep. Lamps dark, snares tidy, men seated by necessity rather than choice. Luis sitting up with his wrist bound in a figure 8 and his eyes hot and whole. Alma rose from her cover with the rifle parked easy on her shoulder, calm as if she were stepping down from a stage after a demanding verse. Brand swung down with a grunt that said he'd earned his age. He passed the reins to no one and walked into Ezra's geometry. "Mr. Cole," he said, a nod that acknowledged both the hand and the work. "You always do this. Make pictures out of trouble?" "Better than graves," Ezra said. Brand crouched by the harness, ran a finger along the wire like a man learning a new dialect. He looked at Pike. "Durgan, I'm obliged to tell you you're under arrest. Charges to follow depend on how long my pencil lasts." Pike spat toward dust and hit his boot. "Won't hold," he said, but there was less religion in it than before. "It'll hold," Brand said, standing. "We got a wire says a judge can be found if I shout loud enough. We got a singer with a bruise that tells time. We got a brother who knows the color of your rope. We got a spur that fell out of your reputation." Ezra laid the silver spur in Brand's palm, and the sheriff turned it once, as if it might confess. "And we've got about 100 townsfolk who've been waiting to remember their voices." Deputies moved through the camp with the hard gentleness of men who'd been on both sides of a night like this. The boy with the big had offered his wrists without being asked. One of the men who'd kicked at Smoke studied Alma with the same bewilderment he'd given the rifle barrel an hour earlier and said, "Ma'am," because he needed to say something decent before the cuffs clicked. Brand set Pike on his feet, then set him across a horse that had learned patience, and tied a lead line long enough for dignity and short enough for sense. They rode into Delilah Ford at a pace that respected sunrise. Town woke in layers. Doors opened on one hinge, then another. A woman with a broom hesitated at her stoop, then held it like a spear, smiling despite herself. Kids who had been told to keep out of the street didn't. Men who had practiced neutrality on their porches, discovered their chairs had opinions, and stood. The barkeep leaned into his doorway, polishing a glass aggressively, as if ready to arrest the next reflection that misbehaved. Pike rode through looking smaller than his legend and more dangerous for it, because a toppled idol is still heavy. Brand put him in a cell and put men at the door who owed him nothing but fairness. Papers were written slow and right, names spelled carefully, facts measured. The merchant who'd sold the boys whiskey at a loss came by to see the price. He left counting under his breath and not liking where the numbers went. A wire stuttered toward the circuit judge, with Ezra's midnight promise folded into Sheriff Brand's daylight authority. By afternoon, fences were speaking neatly again. Luis and Ezra reset the cut line with new staples that bit like new resolve. The goats returned to their arguments with weeds as if the world had intended no interruptions. Alma stood by, sleeves rolled, handing staples and humor in equal measure. When the last wire twanged clean, she blew hair from her forehead and smiled a small, entire smile that made the whole day decide to be worth it. At sundown the Desert Star filled without swagger and made a room out of itself. Alma climbed the low stage and sang not of vengeance, but of weather, about rain that arrives quiet after a summer of threats. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a rose petal that proved color exists without apology. Men listened with their hats off, a respect usually reserved for graves and births. When she finished, the silence that followed wasn't fear anymore. It was the kind of silence a town makes when it realizes it has listened to itself and liked what it heard. Ezra watched from his window table with coffee he didn't need and a stillness that belonged to no one else. Sheriff Brand found him after the second song and touched the brim of his hat. "Wire came back," he said. "Judge in 2 days. I'd like you at the hearing." "I'll be there," Ezra said. "You leaving after?" Brand asked,